Now, it may be that you just got hired for the first time to teach college, and you probably have a really good degree, some really good credentials, but maybe you haven't taught before, you haven't taught very much. What I've found is a lot of institutions don't really have any training in how to teach. So I'm going to put together everything I've learned in my 20 years of teaching and share it with you right now. Now, I have taught over 50 different classes in the classroom, including network engineering, mathematics, and even history of video games. I've been trained under a program called Train the Trainer, and I'm a certified technical trainer, or CTT+. Okay, the first thing I want to talk to you about today is using the whiteboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is write my name and the agenda for today. Okay, so there's the subject and my name. Then we'll be talking about various aspects. All right, so I've written the first two things I'm going to talk about up there. So this is a really important thing I've learned. For one, no matter what, when your students come into class, they know what your name is. It might take them a few weeks to remember if they have a lot of different classes and everything like that. And so they don't have to feel embarrassed. If they raise their hand, they can say, hey, Mr. Weese, or whatever you want them to call you. Right? So there it is. And then they'll also be able to look and see what you're doing that day. And part of that is something called tell, teach, tell. This is an important principle. Basically what we're saying here is to help students remember things, to the things that you teach in class. First you tell them what you're going to teach them about. And part of telling them is writing up the agenda on the board, right? So for instance, the first two things we're going to talk about is using the whiteboard and how to do introductions to your students on the first day. Now, then you actually teach the subject, but you do a review at the end, right? So this last tell here is a review. Now you can also see probably why you shouldn't use the green marker. But I like having more than one color. We're going to talk about that in a second. All right. So we tell, teach, tell. Basically, I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about, then I'm going to teach it, and then at the end we're going to review. This is what we learned. Now this is sort of a rule of three thing. It helps people remember when they hear something 3 times. We'll come back to this more later. Now the use of colors too. It's really important that when you write on the board that really, if you're using a whiteboard, you have at least 2 colors. Okay, because you want to be able to highlight and differentiate between different things. So I'm going to talk about that, and at the same time I'm going to talk about how to stand in front of the board. The wrong way is to turn your back to the students. Another wrong way is to block whatever's on the board. Now normally I'm going to try not to do this. Now it's good to walk around. You should move around and things like that. But as you're writing on the board, what you should do is cheat to one side or the other. It's actually kind of an actor's trick if you think about it. Think about your audience being the camera lens, and as they're watching you, what you're doing is you're writing on the board, but you're also sort of trying to cheat toward them and face them. This makes them feel more involved in what you're doing. If you completely turn your back to them, then basically that's kind of cutting them off emotionally a little bit. So what happens is we don't want to do that, but we also don't want to block their way, right? We want to make sure they can see what's on the board. So for instance, I'm going to stand over here, and let's say I'm going to do like a math problem or something like that. Now this I usually leave up for a while. I wrote it a little bigger here than I normally write it in the top corner, but I'll leave it for maybe the first even half hour or so, unless I really want that board space for something else. But let's say I'm going to do some algebra. Okay, so now I can use color here to say like problem 1, and you can see that is separate from, don't stand in front of it, right? See, that's separate from there. Now as I'm writing too, I'm kind of standing to the side here, and you can see what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to do the steps of the problem. And this is what I like to do. Let's say I'm going to solve this. Okay, well, let's see. Let's get rid of the smaller x. So I'll subtract 3x from both sides. So I'm going to switch colors here again so you can see what I'm doing. That x cancels out. That becomes 12x plus 3. Now I'm down to 3 terms. So once again, I'll eliminate a term. All right, well, I've got 12x and I've got a plus 3, so I'll subtract 3 from both sides. You can see once again that I'm using different colors here, okay? And I'll get negative 10 is 12x. Then I'll divide both sides by the coefficient here. 12, right? So this cancels out here. I'll get x. I get negative 10 over 12, but that's also known as negative 5 over 6. Okay, and so I'm standing off to the side, right? As I'm writing, I'm not turning too much to face the board. I'm not blocking. I mean, wherever you stand, if it's a big room and there's students off to the side, there are going to be some people who can't see. So keep that in mind too. Don't stay in the same place. So even as I'm writing this, I'll write, and then when I finish, switch to the other side as I'm talking about when I go over it. Okay, what did we do here? Well, we started off, we had 4 terms. We canceled out the smallest x by subtracting it from both sides, and then we kept going. All right, so that's use of color. Another good use of color is you might have more than one problem you're putting on the board at the same time. And so what you would do there is you could use one color for one of them and one for the other to keep them separate, right? So if I started doing something like this, and then I put another problem over here, and I worked on both of them, right? The students could look back at the 2 different colors and see which problem was which. And not only that, you can leave them up there for a while, right? If I did both of these. Let's just do them. What I'll do is I'll do some editing magic, so I'll edit to the end of the problem so you don't have to watch me do some more algebra, especially if you're like a geography teacher or something like that. And we're back. So now you can see that I've got 2 separate problems here on the board indicated by 2 different colors. They're all numbers, so if the students are looking, they might be like, oh, which one's which? But now that I've got the colors there, it's very clear which problem is which. So use of colors is really important. Now you can box things, kind of like I did earlier, right, with the tell, teach, tell. Basically use colors because it helps students' brains too. If everything's all in one color, it all seems to kind of blend together. You could use one color for headings and then another color for other notes, right? Kind of like I did here with my agenda. All right, so there's some things you should keep in mind, right? For instance, if I'm doing some math problems and I'm doing one at a time, I'm going to leave the other problem up on the board while I use the other space next to it. So I start another math problem, right? So let's say I go here, and I'm going to do a trig problem or something like that here. But I'm not going to erase the entire board. I'm just going to erase one of the problems so the students can still look at the last problem I did while I'm working on this problem. So it'll give them some time, if they needed it, to still look and observe. In fact, what I do a lot of times is I will teach something by doing it 3 times. And so I'll leave the old problem up there on the board so they can look and see how it was done while they work on the new problem themselves. All right, a couple other things, just interesting things to know about the whiteboard. Years ago, I did learn that some of the whiteboard cleaner is very toxic. I'm just going to recommend that you research online different whiteboard cleaners. But the other problem with whiteboard cleaners is if you don't use a standard whiteboard cleaner, it often will take off the special film that whiteboards are coated with, and then they'll no longer erase very well. So wherever you are, if you're just using Windex or something for erasing your whiteboards, it actually could get rid of the film that helps the whiteboard erase in the first place. So you want to be cautious of that. So the cleaners can be toxic, but also some cleaners can wipe away the film. Also, the markers can be toxic. You want to look and make sure that whatever brand you're using is more of a non-toxic brand, especially if you're sensitive to that stuff. I used to erase with my hands all the time, and I've been teaching 20 years, like I told you, right? So, oh, I messed up X, or X looks too little long, and I do that all day. I try not to do that too much, though, because God knows how much ink I'm absorbing through my hands and what kind of chemicals are in that, especially, like I said, after so many years. All right, so be careful with the toxic stuff, too, on your board. One thing also that I always recommend when you leave your class, erase your board, right? It's just common courtesy for the next instructor that's going to be in your classroom. All right, so pretty much any class you do, the first day of class, you're going to introduce yourself. Now, it's really important that when you introduce yourself, you establish two things. You establish competence and authority. It's really important to have those two things in the classroom. Now, I started teaching when I was in my 20s, and I looked the same age as my college students. And so it was really important that when I got into the classroom, that I established that I knew what I was talking about, right? And I was a computer teacher, so I came in and I said, look, I have the MCSE, I have a computer science degree, I have these other credentials. You know, eventually I wrote a computer book, so I'd mention the book, right? I'd mention my credentials that I had to help with the class, right? I used to work, my first job out of college, I worked for the CIA as a network engineer. That will get you some credibility too, right? So anything in your background that you have that will establish you as credible to teaching the class. And to establish authority, well, some of that is going to be in how you look and how you act, right? I'm also planning on doing a public speaking tutorial similar to this one. But right now, what I want to talk about is just, you should have a confident posture, not arrogant. You should have a relaxed posture, but not slouching. You should have authority. You should make eye contact with your students. You should project your voice, right? Make sure you do all of these things, especially on the first day. The students want to trust in you. They want to believe that you have competence and authority. They want to know that and feel that. So when you're teaching the class, you're the captain, right? And you're taking everyone along the ride with you. And they want to feel like they can go on that trip with you. Okay, now, the way I usually do it is like this. I'll put the introduction stuff on the board, right? So you can see here, introductions, who am I and who are you? So of course I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'll have the students up here. I'm going to say, look, these are the things I want you to tell me about yourself. Your name, that's obvious. What your major is, what your focus is in that major, right? So for instance, I'm at a film college right now. So if they're a filmmaker, I say, all right, are you focusing on cinematography or screenwriting or something like that? And then usually I like to have something personal in there just for fun, just to be kind of relaxing. I ask what their favorite drink is. The joke is usually, well, you have to drink something or you'll die, so you probably have a favorite drink. There we go. Boom, we're done, right? And then after telling them what I'm going to ask them to tell me, then I'll take the pressure off them and introduce myself first, right? So you should introduce yourself first and tell them about you and your experience, but you also want to seem open, welcoming, and inviting. So now I understand that you could be at a college where you're teaching a 101 class and it's a lecture hall with 300 people. Then you're not going to have the students introduce themselves, obviously, because you won't have time for that. But it is important to get a feel for the class and how they are, right? So you want to spend a little bit of time maybe asking them some questions during your introduction. How many of you, is this your first semester? Raise your hand. How many of you are computer science majors? Raise your hand. You know, call out some different majors. Ask them some different questions. How many of you are from the state? How many of you are from out of state? Because now you're interacting with them instead of just being, it's the Steve show or, you know, the instructor show, right? You're involving them in it a little bit on that first day as you do the introduction.
All right, and that brings us to the end of part 1 of how to teach college. So we're going to do a little recap here. Remember, the first thing you do every day is write your name and the agenda, or have it shown on the screen somewhere, because that's the very first part of the tell, teach, tell, right? This is your first tell of the day. Tell, teach, tell also is part of the rule of 3, right? Students need to hear things 3 times to remember them. So you're going to tell them, teach them about it, and tell them again in your review at the end. When you use a whiteboard, remember to use at least 2 colors. It helps demarcate things, helps students' brains focus on different parts of the board at different times. And it's also just boring to have 1 color anyway. Make sure you stand to the side when you write and when you talk. Definitely don't talk to the board, and don't face the board when you're writing on it. We want to be open and have a posture that's facing the students, but also our voice needs to project to the students themselves. As a courtesy to the next instructor, always remember to erase your board when you leave. Now, when you do introductions, you want to project two things to the students: your competence, your qualifications in a way, right? They want to believe that you understand the subject and you're qualified to teach it, and your authority. When you stand up there, you have to have good posture, good voice tone, and be very prepared and clear about what you're saying. That's going to establish on the very first day that you have competence to teach the subject and that you are in charge of the class. And students want that. They want to know that you're capable and able to take them to where they want to go. Now, a couple of other notes that I didn't mention earlier. One is that when you are writing notes on the board, when you're lecturing, always give pauses after major points. This gives note takers a moment to write things down, and it also gives your thinkers in the class a moment to think about what you said. Please, when you lecture, don't just ramble on and on and on and on without pauses. Pauses are great, and they add emphasis to your important points. Finally, when you speak, project in a clear and confident voice. If you haven't done any practice speaking, well, this is a good time to get working on that. So you have good projection, everybody hears you, and you sound confident. We'll see you for part 2.